Welcome to Wireless Future. My name is Eric Larsson, and I'm here as always with my colleague Emil Björnsson. Emil, hello. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. It's finally spring in Sweden.
Oh yeah, it is. It's really nice outside, indeed. So today, the topic for our discussion is going to be on distributed and cell-free massive MIMO. And the context in which to view this is that cellular massive MIMO is now a commercial reality. It is a technology that went from, say, a wild academic idea about a decade ago to a hot research topic in academia, to a main topic of the 5G standardization, to a commercial reality where all the main vendors are selling and deploying projects and networks are out there, operating the equipment, right? Distributed and cell-free massive MIMO is an emerging concept where the idea is that instead of having the antennas mounted in a panel with half a wavelength of spacing or on that order, the antennas are rather distributed over a larger geographical area. And this technology has many names: distributed massive MIMO, cell-free massive MIMO, user-centric MIMO, network MIMO. There's also the notion of COMP and coordinated multi-point transmission, ultra-dense networks, and so forth. And I thought we'd today discuss these different technologies and terms. And I also know that you, Emil, just as published together with Özlem Tukvedemir and Lucas Angionetti, a new book,
That's right.
Foundations of User-Centric Cell-Free Massive MIMO. It just came out, and I'm the privileged owner of a signed copy. Thank you very much. And congratulations, of course, to such a comprehensive guide and treatment of the topic.
Thank you.
So would you like to get started, Emil, to explain here? What are all these terms, and do they all refer to the same thing, or is there a distinction between them?
So I think these are partially overlapping terms, but they are not identical, and the devil is in the detail here as usual. So I would say that distributed MIMO and maybe network MIMO are more or less the same thing. So the idea is that instead of having antennas that are serving you located on one place, they are distributed so that it's physically different locations. So you as a user would view them as being at different locations. Then COMP, or coordinated multipoint, was sort of in 4G a naming for the idea of having multiple base stations that are serving the same user. And that could be done in different ways. They could just coordinate what you're doing. So I'm scared of this user, you're scaling that user. Let's try to avoid interference. Or they could try to adapt their powers, or they could transmit jointly to the user. And then we come into the same thing as distributed MIMO or network MIMO. Then you mentioned ultra-dense networks. This is an entirely different thing from the beginning. The idea that you are deploying a huge number of base stations. Small base stations located everywhere. They should outnumber the number of active users by far. And then it's still a cellular network, so you're still connecting to one of them. And then finally, the combination then would be that you have a lot of base stations everywhere, but they are jointly serving you. And that is what we have been starting to call cell-free massive MIMO or user-centric cell-free massive MIMO, because the user-centric means that you're of course not served by a base station that is 10 kilometers away. You have some kind of cluster of surrounding base stations that are serving you.
Right, so basically you're saying that cell-free massive MIMO is the ultimate embodiment of this idea that you'd be all surrounded by service antennas and they'd be all operating phase coherently together, but effectively, as a user, you stand somewhere, then you'll receive only a signal from the handful or 10 or so antennas or access points that are closest to you.
Yeah, at least it's the best combination that we know so far. Maybe it's not the ultimate form. Maybe there is something better to do in the future. But it's the latest version of this technology, combining all the good aspects from the past.
Yeah. So now, I suppose, I mean, these deployments here could be both indoors and outdoors, right? So when we say geographically distributed, they could be anything from separating the antennas, I mean, going from like half a wavelength spacing that we have in conventional co-located massive MIMO panels to something like, well, half a meter or, you know, at least multiple wavelengths, right? Up to outdoor deployments where I suppose you could have like hundreds of meters in between of the access points. Is that a correct understanding of the terminology here?
Yes, I would say that. So from a user perspective, I think the important thing is that the array sort of looks large from your perspective. So if I'm sitting here in a small room and you spread out the antennas over the wall, well, then I need to move around my eyes to see them. And if you're outdoor, you also spread them out, or then you're seeing a larger area, and then you can spread them out even more.
Right. So in what sense will now distributed, or I mean, let's call this let's use the term cell-free massive MIMO, because that seems to be really the term that's emerging here. In what sense is cell-free massive MIMO, where the antennas are spread out, is that superior to like building cellular systems with massive MIMO panels that sit on towers and serve the terminals?
So it always depends on how your propagation environment looked like and where you can deploy things. But the general idea is that when you have just a few locations with big base stations that might have a lot of possibilities of directing signals towards you, but they're still on a few locations. That means that there will be large variations in your signal quality depending on if you are close by or far away. And by spreading out the antennas, you are evening out those type of variations. So on the average, you should have a better, more constant signal quality. Then you might sort of take away the benefit of having all the antennas and you're standing right next to it. But you also take away the possibility of being very far from all of the antennas. Now you are close to at least some of the antennas, and that's what we call a macro diversity.
So it's really this extreme level of macro diversity here that's the main benefit then, right? I mean, the fact that no matter where you are almost certain to be in the vicinity of, well, at least one of these access points, or perhaps even a few up to a handful of them. Is that like the way to think about the benefits here as compared to cellular deployments?
Yes, so that is the first step. But then you could create a cellular network in this way, and that is what we call then ultra-dense network. But the problem with that is that if you as a user have a strong signal to not only one access point, but many, then you will get immense interference from those access points that are not serving you, unless you let all the access point with a strong signal to you serve you. And then you're coming into this distributed MIMO idea. And then you can utilize these access points to jointly transmit to you. So they focus the energy at your point, and they can also control how they're transmitting to control interference. And I would like to compare this to sort of when you like to localize someone. If you're just looking from one direction, you don't have so much possibilities of seeing different people. You can only separate them in one angle direction. But when you have multiple locations, you can triangulate someone. You can see them from different angles, and you can figure out where you would like to focus your attention, either to localize, but in this case, to focus your signal energy. And in that way, you have new possibilities of interference suppression by focusing signals in space.
It's a good analogy. So essentially what you're saying is that, I mean, all the access points together act as a huge antenna array that can beamform and also suppress interference, such that when you serve a particular terminal, you also make sure to not spread directional interference that could hit the others.
Yes, and the term beamforming is something that traditionally meant, particularly from one location, you're forming a angular single beam towards a user. And now we are sort of generalizing this concept, and we're not forming beams that we can picture anymore, but the signal energy comes from different directions, and then around the location we are, they happen to meet each other, be totally in phase, amplify each other, and therefore locally you get a stronger signal.
Right, it's really like, I mean, each access point generates and transmits a waveform, and when these waveforms transmitted by all the access points in the network superimpose at the terminals, then they superimpose constructively at the terminal they want to transmit the signal to and destructively at the others, so that no interference is generated. Is that a good way to think about what's going on here?
Exactly. And you can also think about like an ocean where you see the waves going up and down, and then you are creating the waves yourself from a few different locations. You make sure that at one particular location you always have very large waves coming up and down, and you only control so it happens at one location.
Right, so it's like in the ocean. I mean, at some spots it'll be good for surfing, and some spots it'll be good for like swimming for the kids, and you can control which spots to behave in what way by selecting the amplitude and phase of the oscillations that you generate.
We should patent that idea of cell-free massive MIMO for surfing applications.
So there's also this notion of favorable propagation, and as I understand, in a cellular massive MIMO system, if you are in like line of sight conditions with your terminal, and the terminal is multiple antennas, then the channel from the terminal to the base station might be ranked efficient, such that you can effectively only send one spatial stream to it. I mean, irrespective of the fact that it has multiple antennas, and in theory would be capable of separating multiple streams. But the issue is that all the signals that reach the terminal come from the base station in such a small angular window that the channel is ranked efficient. Cell-free massive MIMO does away with this problem to some extent. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes. So in order to be able to receive multiple signals from a base station, you need signals to reach it from sufficiently different directions, so you can use your receive antennas and sort of listen in that direction, then listen in that direction. Of course, you do it at the same time. And if you don't have a propagation environment that delivers that automatically, well, then you are then setting up the transmitters and from different locations, and then you're receiving the signal from different angles, and you can then use your receiver array to listen to these different signals and separate them and send different data.
Right, it's really like, I mean, each antenna or each access point in this cell-free network sends a different stream to the terminal, and they all come into the terminal from very different directions, and therefore can be separated by using the multiple antennas that the terminal has. So is cell-free massive MIMO related to the concept of Cloud RAN?
Yes and no. So I would say Cloud RAN, that is a sort of the architecture underneath the sort of how you build your network. So it's a cloud radio access network. And traditionally, when you put up a base station, you have the antenna and the radio, then you have a baseband processing unit, a computer that is computing how you generate your signal and decodes the signal and things like that. And then traditionally, these things have been on the same locations. You put up a base station, a tower, you put all the equipment there. But then over the past 10 years, there have been this willingness to move the computing power to a joint location. Why? Well, if you have 10 base stations in an area, it's very unlikely that all those 10 base stations will be loaded fully at the same time, to have a lot of users everywhere. So if you are co-locating their processing powers, you might get away with having 5 times the processing power instead of 10 times that you would need to serve these 10 base stations. So this is sort of a movement where you move these things. We call it to the cloud, but it's not like the cloud that can be anywhere in the world. It's rather an edge cloud, so somewhere in the neighborhood, because the speed of light limits you how far away you can put these type of things and still have a good latency. So that is what we have been doing when it comes to sort of rebuilding cellular networks. But then we can utilize this structure in order to build a cell-free massive MIMO system. So when people start to talk about the distributed MIMO ideas, one of the limitations that made it hard to build was precisely that, the base stations need to send this much signals to each other. So we need to have dedicated cables for that, and that is too expensive. But if you are anyway going to have a set of access points that are doing their processing at the same physical location, at the same edge cloud, well, then it's easy for them to share information with each other because it's in the same memory. So it's sort of one of the enablers for actually building this type of cell-free or distributed MIMO systems that people have been envisioning for a while.
So Cloud Run is really about sharing computational resources required for the radio processing among different access points. And
at least that was the first point, and then we are now also in the case of maybe we don't need to have dedicated hardware anymore for this that the vendor needs to create themselves, but maybe we can use off-the-shelf hardware, have it more like server processing capabilities, and then we virtualize everything. So there is a lot of other things going into that, and maybe we will cover that in a different episode.
Sure, yeah. So in terms of different types of deployments of cell-free massive MIMO, there is this idea or concept of radio stripes that I know you have a few papers, and my understanding is that it's supposed to be like a stripe of tape, essentially, where that might be a couple of centimeters thick, and but very thin, like a millimeter or even less, and you could roll out like tape and attach to the walls, or even like building facades outdoors. Could you explain a little more on this idea?
Yes. So the issue with deploying a cell-free network is, okay, you want to have access point everywhere, then you need to have power supply, you need to have a cable where you can send the data back and forth, and that requires a lot of both engineering efforts to put things up, and you would need to be allowed to put up things everywhere. And then when we were starting to discuss this with people in the industry, both you and me, I think, talked with people at Ericsson, for example, then they were saying that, it will be too many cables. So this will be complicated. And then they came back to us and said, well, we have this idea that if you're going to draw a cable from one location to an antenna somewhere far away, why not put everything into the cable? So we do the power supply through the cable, and we put additional antennas within the cable. So one cable becomes the entire distributed MIMO base station. So that was sort of the starting point, and then they started to call these radio stripes. And I think on the Mobile World Congress, Ericsson was also showing something that they call radio stripes for the industry as a concept.
So it is a bit like, going from a conventional base station, and you think of something the size of a fridge, and that has like lots of electronics and circuit boards and power supplies and so forth inside, and then is connected to antennas through maybe coax cables that in themselves might be quite thick, right? To something that looks like a roll of tape, and that seems like an amazing vision indeed. But could one actually build anything like that? I would think that just the distribution of electrical power would require a DC supply. A copper cable to carry the current, right? And also to transmit the actual data along this stripe. Then either one would have to use transmit through electrical signals, which requires to start with at least the ground plane, or perhaps a coax cable sort of architecture, or one could use maybe fiber optics. Or so what is the vision here in terms of what actual technology that would be used to transmit, on one hand, the signal itself, and concurrently to that also the electrical power?
So I think it's still a question of trying to figure out the best implementation of this. So one option would indeed be to just build this on Ethernet cables. So the typical internet cables, there is already a technology where you can transmit power over that one. You can transmit 100 watt, I think, over 100 meters or something like that. But then the issue, I think, with that is that every time you put in an antenna, you probably need to terminate the cable, and then you put your antenna there, and then you take another piece of power of Ethernet. So there might be a lot of losses along the way, but you could build something, at least daisy chain like that, of a certain length. But ideally, you would like to use fiber cables, both so you could get the high capacity of the fiber cable, and because you could use different kinds of splitters to let the fiber cable go all the way to the end, but then also take out signals from it using splitters at the different antennas along the way.
So basically transmitting the signal itself over an optical fiber and then using wavelength division splitters or something like that along the way. So I mean, it seems to me that a realistic embodiment of this vision would be more of like a Christmas tree lighting, where you have like a cable, and on the cable there are lamps attached, right? So here there'd be a cable and there'd be small antennas attached to it with some separation, maybe a meter or half a meter or something like that.
I think that is a good description, and I think one thing to mention there is as well that the idea is to sort of start more from the type of circuitry that we have in cell phones. So the cell phone is pretty large today, but it's mainly a screen and a big battery, and then there's just a small radio chip there. So if you take out those things, you can make it fairly small. And then if we are targeting the conventional, like say 3.5 gigahertz band, then it will probably be like in the Christmas tree, where you have a cable and then you have things sticking out of it. But if you go up in frequency, maybe to 30 gigahertz in the millimeter wave bands, or even above that, you might even have the antenna so small that they are just sticked on the outside of it, and you are barely seeing it.
That's of course a good point. I mean, the antenna size shrinks in proportion to the wavelength, right? So at millimeter wave, you could really build very thin structures and very small antennas, and it would look, if not like a stripe of tape, at least it could be very thin potentially, and like flexible, and could attach and be easily installed in buildings and on the outdoors on the facade of buildings.
And I think that there are a few different potential use cases for this. One is in the millimeter wave bands, where we have this issue with that the signals easily gets blocked. So they are coming in from, if they just come from one direction, if you happen to block it with your hand or your body, you'd have a weak signal. But if the signals are coming from many different directions, well, then the risk that we block all of them at the same time should be substantially smaller. So that would be one sort of reason to use it. And another reason is that there are many like historical places where you are not allowed to put up big base stations that look ugly, but you still have cables on the walls that you are not seeing. So if you can put up something there, just that you have cables that are protecting against lightning, for example, you can put up base stations that are invisible.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the technical challenges in actually building anything like this. I mean, obviously there'll be lots of challenges in designing and building the electronics, right? But what are the challenges from a, say, comm theory and signal processing perspective?
Yes, so there are all of these different layers in the protocols in wireless, and I think most of the attention over the last decade have been on the physical layer. So that is what I've been working with for a long time, and that is sort of what we are mainly summarizing in the book that you showed us. So what kind of signal processing goes in there in order to learn the communication channels, in order to design how you transmit and how you receive and how you distribute this over the access point and the edge cloud processor and these type of things. But then there are a lot of other challenges that are appearing. So you would like to sort of understand how you should distribute the signals and the processing, where should you do what in order to make it as efficient as possible, to limit how much information needs to be sent around. And when you're sending out around information, you might need to quantize them, and you will have latency issues that it takes time to send things around. So there are these type of challenges, and you want it to be scalable, so you can build a big network without having too much resources at every location, and still keep it sort of self-freed so that everyone is served by all of its surrounding access points. And you want everything to be synchronized, and you need to be able to control a big network, even if you are have something that is large and where you're not breaking it down into small controllable regions, but the entire system needs to be controlled.
So, I mean, it sounds like, so I understand what you're saying here is that most of the limitations in terms of the communication theory is on the physical layer, right? I mean, no surprise, it's always the physics that limits what we can do, just like biology limits what human can do, right? I mean, I can't jump from, the garden up to on the roof of the house, for example, and for the so it's always the physics that limits ultimately for a given transmit power and so forth how much data we can convey, right? But so I understand there are challenges on the physical layer in terms of how to design waveforms and beamforming and get channel estimates and all that. Are there also challenges on higher layers in the protocol stack?
Yes,
to make cell-free massive MIMO work?
I think that is where the main challenges are for the moment from a research perspective, because as I said, we know pretty well how to do the signal processing at the physical layer, but the issue is that we are used to building these networks, cellular networks, where you are sort of you take some kind of divide and conquer approach to networking. You say we have a big region, let's divide into cells, then every cell can operate autonomously from each other, and then we can do things there. They can schedule the users, they can select the powers, they can do different types of tasks in terms of controlling things. But if you now are connecting together a lot of things, then you have the issue that you now need to solve these problems over big regions, and you have sort of the butterfly effect. If you're changing something in one location, this will influence the entire network. So we need to find ways of dealing with this and still keep the complexity reasonable.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess one could make a case perhaps that this is still a physical layer sort of problem, right? But okay,
yeah, but I think
call it network, doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, in the protocol stack, it's more like the medium access layer, the network layer.
The MAC
example.
layer might be. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, so now I think we were onto this earlier also with distributed processing. Is that possible, and how would it work?
So there are a few different locations where you could do your processing, and to keep it simple, there will be two different locations: at the access points where you have the antennas and radios, and at this edge cloud. And then I can think of, to start with, 3 different ways of doing it. One is to try to distribute everything as much as possible. So you try to do everything at the access point. But there is one thing you can't do. If they should transmit the same data, well, then you need to encode the data at the edge cloud, send it out, and then the access point can select how they transmit on their own. And if they should collaborate in terms of decoding the data, well, then they need to make their soft guesses of what the data is, send that to the CPU, who is fusing the information and makes the final decisions, taking all of their input into account. So that is sort of a fully distributed approach. Then there is the centralized approach where the access point tries to do nothing. So you just receive things, sample, and then you send everything up to the edge cloud, who is doing all the processing for you. And then in the downlink, it is pre-computing everything that should be done, and then you send it back to the access point, which is just converting it to an analog signal, send it out through the antenna, and that's it. And then maybe you could find something in between, some kind of semi-distributed thing. And one option is to sort of try to make use of, if you have a radio stripe, that the signal is flowing from one access point to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, until it reaches the CPU or the edge cloud. And then you try to sort of improve the signals along the way. So you get some kind of sequential improvement of the estimates, and then you are distributing the processing in that particular way, so there's not much left to do at the central processing point.
So you're saying essentially that there is an advantage to in distributing as much as processing and putting as much as possible of the computational burden, say, on the access points, and as little as possible on the edge cloud or the central processing unit. still, I mean, it might not be entirely obvious why you could not just, I think as you suggested, also just sample the signals and feed them over the fiber and then deal with everything at the edge cloud. And the edge cloud could be like a fridge size kind of big box that stands somewhere and has unlimited power supply and no space constraints and so forth. So is there like a consensus on the best way of organizing all these processing and computations?
I think from a communication performance perspective, it's probably the best thing to centralize it. At least if you have the front-haul infrastructure enough to so you can quantize the signals with high resolution and set them up there, and you can live with the potentially increased latency of doing that. I think it depends a lot on also how the network is built. So if you have many antennas on every access point, so that in particular if the number of antennas there is outnumbering how many users you are serving from that access point, in that case you have a higher dimension of your information that you receive than the number of users you're serving. And then by compressing that information down to a dimension that matches with number of users, you have less information to send up to the central processing unit. So if that is the case, it's good to have some of the processing, some kind of pre-processing compression at the access point. While if you only have one antenna on every access point, but you are serving a multitude of users and you are building the network based on the idea that every access point is unable to deal with interference at all, but by getting help from the surrounding ones, then you are making it work. And in that case, if you only have one antenna but you serve 4 users, then you will have to send up 4 times the information if you do the pre-processing at the access point. So it depends on the architecture there. But I'm personally in favor of trying to centralize as much as possible.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it seems that there's a gold mine of research problems here in terms of finding the actual optimum for how the processing should be distributed, right? Whether to do as much as possible at the access points or whether to do almost or nothing there and then collect all the samples at the edge cloud and let it do the job.
Yeah, precisely.
Another thing you mentioned earlier, I think, butterfly effect, and I think we were onto this topic of scalability, which is obviously critical here. And yeah, maybe you want to have a go at that.
Yeah, so you want to be able to build a large network with a lot of access points, having a lot of users, and then you want it also to be scalable, so you can build that. But then the difficult thing is to actually define in a concise manner what does it mean to be scalable, and this is something I spent some time thinking about how to deal with. If you say that I have 100 access points, and then as the number of users is increasing, well, what you typically do in your network after a while, if you cannot handle more users, you start to schedule users at different times. So from that perspective, scalability might not be a big issue. You can just, if you have too many users, you just let them take turns. I think the important thing in terms of scalability is rather that as the number of users is increasing, you will probably put up another antenna, another radio stripe, and get more access point into it. And and that will then entail you put them up in order to serve more users. And then you don't want to be in a situation where you need to go back and upgrade all of the other access points, so they can help the new ones that you put up. So I think that is how to sort of define scalability. You need to be able to have a finite amount of processing power and memory and things at every access point, and then you should be able to grow the network and it should still work. You don't need to go back and operate. And it's then things like memory, processing capability, and frontal capacity for every access point that you would like to stay fixed as you're growing the network.
I guess my understanding of the scalability problem has been that, I mean, if you take a cell-free network with access points and an edge server or central processing unit, and then you grow it, so you add more and more and more access points. Eventually, I mean, it's like it could cover the whole world, right? But that seems impossible to cover the whole world with a single edge cloud. So eventually you'd have to break it up into multiple, say, air quotes, cell-free networks, where, you know, each cell-free network has an edge cloud and a bunch of access points. Now the question is, I mean, will these cell-free networks not then start to interfere with one another? And wouldn't one have to coordinate their operation somehow, just like one has to coordinate the operation of base stations in a cellular network? I mean, the distinction would be that, you know, it's like we would have cells with base stations, but the base station itself would consist of an edge cloud and then distributed antennas. So we would recreate all these problems with like cell boundaries and handovers and you know, power control and so forth. Is that a, say, valid understanding of the scalability issue in your opinion?
Yes, this is one of the issues, one of the things you would like to avoid. So when people in the 4G era started to talk about coordinated multipoint or COMP, what it all culminated in was that, we cannot coordinate the entire world, so let's take our base stations, let's divide them into, here is one set of base stations, here's another one, non-overlapping, here's another one, let's operate this together, maybe using an edge cloud, and then we are creating sort of bigger cells, but with distributed big base stations. So it's not as we are viewing it as having many small access points, but it's still the same type of approach. And this is what we call a network-centric approach. So you divide your coverage area into regions still. It's just that you have different types of equipment in there, and you still have the inter-cell interference issue. So that is why we like to call it user-centric, where you would like to make sure that wherever you are, you will always be served by all the surrounding access point. Not that, okay, if this one belongs to this edge cloud, this one belongs to that other edge cloud, and you can only be served by one of them. So we need these edge clouds to talk to each other as well.
So in that respect, I mean, a cell-free system that consists of multiple edge clouds with their access points is not that different from a cellular system. You still need to coordinate among the edge clouds somehow, just like you have to coordinate among the base stations in a cellular network, right?
Yes. I think the way to view it might be that, so for every user, there is a task to be done, which entails processing its uplink and its downlink data. And that processing needs to be placed somewhere or distributed over the network. And you need to involve everyone who could sort of have an effect on the user. And then it starts to become complicated when you build a network large. And I think that is why these ideas have been around for a fairly long time, but it still is viewed as hard to implement it over a larger scale. But that's why we're doing research.
It is, and indeed. I mean, another thing here which comes with the, which is connected to the scalability question, is also the need for synchronization, right? And there are, in fact, a couple of different kinds of synchronization. Number one, you need a coarse time sync so that you stay within your cyclic prefix and OFDM and so forth. Number two, you need a frequency sync that's good enough. But then more importantly, you also need two kinds of calibration. First, reciprocity calibration. If you operate in TDD, time division duplex, and rely on reciprocity for the beamforming, then each antenna at each one of the access points has to be calibrated for reciprocity, such that there's no phase imbalance between uplink and downlink. And number two, the access points also have to be phase aligned, such that everyone agrees on when, say, the global phasor points to 0 for the joint beamforming and the downlink to work. And this can be achieved by, using different calibration techniques. But isn't there a scalability issue here as well? I mean, that, if it's one thing to keep the antenna synchronized if we build a network that sits in the room here or spans the garden or maybe even like a couple of 100 meters outdoors. But if we're going now to synchronize a larger area, this seems to be a huge challenge. How to actually distribute and keep them all to the same phase. You want to comment on that?
Yes. So I think there are several aspects to that. One is that even if we are able to synchronize them exactly to the same phase, since we are looking at large propagation areas, we cannot for hundreds of kilometers keep everything time synchronized. For example, in LTE and maybe in 5G, you have a cyclic prefix, as you was mentioning, and that might mean that signals that are transmitted within a few kilometers could be synchronized with each other in the uplink and the downlink. Even if we can synchronize things perfectly, we'll still have issues over longer distances. But then, yes, the access point that are in one group of access point that is serving one particular user, you want them to be synchronized with each other so that they can transmit the signal so they reach in phase, so they are added on top of each other. And then next to that, there is another user that is served by partially the same access point, but not exactly, and they also need to be phase synchronized, and then it sort of spills over the entire network, and you get this kind of like butterfly-like effect. And I think the aspect there is that you cannot get everything to be perfectly synchronized, but you need the synchronization errors between sort of neighboring access point to be fairly small. So we need a procedure where we can keep this one small, and maybe you can use GPS receptions, for example, in outdoor scenarios for something like that, or sending around. So you have a local clock in each access point, and then you send around signals that helps you to synchronize these type of things.
I mean, there's certainly no shortage of technical challenges here to solve and to conduct research on. And synchronization is certainly one of them. I thought of, before we close up here, to talk a little bit about the history of these ideas. And I think we concluded the other day when we spoke, Emil, that we were looking at the history of MIMO, right? Multi-antenna transmission in general, and it goes back at least, I think we found some, was it a patent or a technical paper by, I think it was Alexanderson, almost 100 years ago, that suggested the use of like more than one antenna in a wireless transmission, right? So yes. For cell-free, where did these ideas originate?
It's always hard to track things back in time, because the more you are looking, the more you find people who are sort of touching upon the same ideas. So there might have been results that I'm not aware of. What I have identified in particular is when these ideas appeared in the information theory area. So in 1994, Aaron Weiner started to talk about the idea of when you are receiving signals from users that the base station should cooperate. And his idea was sort of that, say that you have three receiving base stations, they have one user each. And that means that every access point will receive one signal that is interested in and two signals that are interfering. And then you cannot really untangle that. But if you connect all of your base stations together, and everyone have one antenna, so that's why you cannot untangle it. But then when you put them together, you have three antennas that are distributed, you have three unknowns, namely your three user signals, and that is something that you can untangle. It's like, without noise, it's like solving a linear system of equations. So that was sort of his idea of doing this in the uplink. And then in 2001, Shamai and Seidel were proposing to do similar type of things in the downlink. And the network MIMO name appeared in 2007. And a lot of these works were about taking a cellular network and then let those base stations work together. So sort of an add-on to cellular network. But there were an interesting early work in 2003 called Distributed Wireless Communication System, which was precisely this idea that we are talking about now, with having access points that are spread out and that are supposed to provide us with a sort of consistent service quality. So it's not based on as an add-on to an existing cellular network. And then I guess there were a lot of work in 3GPP for standardization, and a lot of work in academia around, say 2007 until 2012, 13 or something like that. I think I entered the area maybe in 2008 or 9 to do some work. And then since coordinated multipoint didn't work out so very much, I think a lot of people left the field for a while. I published a book in 2013, but then I also stayed away from a few years. And then in 15, the cell-free massive MIMO papers appeared. I guess you had your first paper on that topic at that time. And that now it's sort of coming back again in its new refined form.
Yeah, so it's all rooted in, say, information theory. So, where does it stand? I mean, the cell-free technology in terms of commercial implementations. For example, there is this company, I think P-Cell or Artemis Networks, that built something that resembled cell-free in the form that we have been discussing it today. Would you want to say something about that?
Yes, so this was a company that there were a lot of fuss about, maybe it was like 5 years ago, and they were deploying something in their lab, and they were going around to companies and conferences and universities to show off a sort of cell-free like network in a room. And I think from reading their white paper, they actually implemented this type of centralized version of things. And then there have been a lot of silence from this company in the last few years, and I know that there are many other big vendors in the field that were looking closely at the technology. And I think the main issue is that it was hard to scale it up for them. So they had a technology that worked in small scale, but to make it work in a bigger scale was an issue.
So we're back really at the scalability issues that we talked about earlier, right? Yeah. So where do we see this heading? I mean, when are we going to live in a world where we are all surrounded by cell-free access points and radio stripes and so forth? Will this happen, I mean, in the next 10 years or in the next 20, or do we have a vision for that?
So whenever there have been a new cellular standard, there's always been the ambition of it being future-proofed, so to say, so you can build whatever cool idea on top of it. And 5G might be successful in that kind of way. So this is a technology that is supporting many of the things. So we should remember that standards are a skeleton with the basic signals that to be done. And one of the things that they have done now is that they are separating what you call the control plane and the data plane. So the control signals are sent out from every access point, so that you can identify an access point and connect to a network. But then once you are connected, you can be served in any way that the network finds fitting. So you could build a cell-free network on top of that. So whenever we talk about cell-free, we mean that during the data transmission, the data should come from all of the access points around you, and all of the access points should be serving you. So in terms of building what we have been talking mostly about in this podcast episode, I think this is something that you can build on top of 5G. And one of the use cases of 5G that there's a lot of talk about is to build private 5G networks, which would be like having a Wi-Fi network but built on 5G technology, using dedicated spectrum, getting rid of all the listen before talk issues that makes Wi-Fi not very scalable to large deployments as well. So there are already products from the big vendors for those type of indoor use cases in company premises, and I think there we will see that they are converging towards a cell-free implementation over maybe the 5 next years or so.
Right, so what you're saying is that everything that we've been discussing here, I mean, and that lies in this vision of cell-free massive MIMO is entirely feasible technically, and that the development and commercial deployment of these systems might in fact happen rather fast. Do we have an idea? I mean, it's always hard to speculate about the future, right? And we both know that, I mean, even, when I think both of us, we started to work on massive MIMO theory like 10 years ago, then at least I never really imagined that things would happen so fast, and that we would be, within less than 10 years, seeing full-scale commercial deployments of what was considered more or less an infeasible, wild academic idea. So it's always hard to speculate about the future, but if we had to speculate, do we think alike here? I mean, do you think, what would you say, Emil? Will we see cell-free massive MIMO full-scale deployed in 5 years, or in 10 years, or in 25 years, or do we not dare to say anything?
I think that we... even if I probably have written papers where I have described cell-free massive MIMO as a beyond 5G or 6G technology in some cases, I think that this will be implemented on top of 5G. Then we probably will discover along the way that there are certain refinements that cannot be implemented on top of the current standard, and that new releases of the new standard cannot deal with. But I think we will see implementations like this in the within the 5G era. So maybe from 5 years from now, there will be some first products that are doing something cell-free-like, and then we will see towards the end of the decade that there are more larger-scale deployments of this kind.
Right, that's a great prospect, and it'll be highly exciting to see where this is heading. So I think that we are at the point where we might want to wrap up here. So thanks a lot, Emil. It's a great conversation. And thanks to the audience for watching and listening. And don't forget to like and subscribe us on YouTube. And see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.